very kind. Thank you. Oh, you're very kind, you guys. Thank you. Well, I just am honored to be here. Harvard is a wonderful place to work, but gosh, I wish Harvard was in Silicon Valley. I want to leave as much time as we can for a conversation with Mark Andreessen. But I'd like to talk to you about three theories from my research that I thought would be useful for the ongoing discussion with Mark. Disruption you know about, so I don't think I'll spend much time about that. I would like to talk about a theory called the capitalist dilemma, which is a theory about where growth comes from. The job to be done is something some of you who've had milkshakes know what it means to hire a product to get the job done. But then two other theories, the law of conservation of modularity and the law of wasting abundance. And the last one applies to, unfortunately, venture capital. So it turns out that if you look at it in a different way, there really only are three types of innovations in the world. And the reason why understanding innovation is so critical is that's the target of investment, and investment is what creates growth. So the first type of innovation we call disruption. And I described it here as three concentric circles. And what they're meant to represent is in the center are customers who have a lot of skill and a lot of money. And the larger circles represent larger populations of people who have progressively less money and less skill. Almost always, industries begin at the center because the first products are complicated and expensive. So we had mainframe computers. You had to be very rich and a lot of skill to have one of those. Cost $2 million. The personal computer brought the cost down to $2,000, and now smartphones brought it to $200. And by making it affordable and accessible, many more people have access to do it. And so you have to hire more people to make it, distribute it, sell it, service it. And that's why, as I say up front, disruptive innovations create growth, and they create jobs. If the data were available, and fortunately or unfortunately they're not, I think that almost all of the net growth and net jobs and net growth comes from these types of innovations. Automobiles is another. The early cars were viewed as toys for the rich. And then Henry Ford made it affordable and accessible so that many more people had access. And then when Toyota came in the 1960s with a little subcompact car they called a Corona, it enabled the rebar of humanity. People we call college students could have a car. And so this kind of innovation has a role in our companies and in our society, and that is, this is the innovation that creates growth. Then there's a second type of innovation that we call sustaining innovations. And sustaining innovations, their role is they make good products better. And they are very important in society because if you don't keep making good products better, your margins will fall and the company will dissolve. So it's very important, and when you go out in the world, most of the innovations that we see are sustaining innovations. But sustaining innovations actually don't create net growth, nor do they create jobs. So just imagine that I'm a salesperson for Toyota, and I convince you to buy a Prius hybrid. If I succeed in selling you that, then you won't buy a Camry. If you buy the next generation of my product, which is better, then you won't buy the last generation, which wasn't as good. And so sustaining innovations are very critical. They have a role, but they don't create growth or jobs. And then the third type of innovation we call efficiency innovations. And their purpose is to help you make more with less. And they also are very important, because if we're not getting ever more efficient, we'll get killed sooner rather than later. But by their very nature, efficiency innovations eliminate jobs. So when when Walmart comes into a community, it's an efficiency innovation. And although they hire people to work for Walmart, in the community, about 9% of the jobs in retailing are lost, because it's a more efficient way of doing things. Toyota Production System is an efficiency innovation. So they eliminate jobs, but they create free cash flow. And that's kind of neat. As long as these guys are creating more jobs than those guys eliminate, and as long as these guys are creating enough increased cash flow to fund the next generation of disruptive innovations, the economy works and the company works. But what's happened in the last 30 years, little by little, is that this connection has been cut by, unfortunately, professors at business schools like me. And we have come to adopt a set of principles from finance that are believed, I always call them doctrines. And those of us who go to this church to get MBAs come to believe that these are actually true and that everybody should follow them. And they, in aggregate, cut that link that I described. So one of the doctrines that we teach in finance is that while we can waste inputs that are abundant and cheap, we have to be careful and use scarce things carefully. So if I just array in front of me all the inputs required to give you the output I committed to, some of these inputs will be abundant and cheap, like sand. I don't need to carefully husband the use of sand. I can waste it if I wanted to, but platinum is very costly and very scarce. And so I have to be really careful and use it only where it's absolutely necessary. And I got to be careful that I don't lose it. And thinking about what's scarce and what's important is really important. So 15 years ago, prior to that, bandwidth was very scarce and costly. And so we designed our systems to account for the costliness, the cost of bandwidth. But then thanks to Corning and a few other people, bandwidth became so cheap and abundant, we called it dark fiber. It was free. And while some companies continue to husband the use of bandwidth, a few others, Netflix, Amazon, and Google, said, hey, wait a minute, if bandwidth is cheap, we can waste bandwidth. And by doing that, they transformed the model of the industry. And one of the things I want to talk about later is that I think that capital has become abundant and cheap. Historically, it was costly and expensive, and we had to carefully husband the use of capital. But now, by any measure, capital is abundant and cheap. And then there are other rules that we have to use when we're deciding whether we'll put money in a company or not. And they're all ratios. So take this one here. Internal rate of return is a fraction. The numerator is profit, and the denominator is a measure of how quickly do we get our money out after we put our money in. And so if I'm a manager, the neat thing about a ratio is I got two options. Sure, I could be more profitable and increase the numerator, but what the heck? If innovation is too hard, I'll just only invest my money in things that pay off in the short term. Either way, IRR goes up and I'm a star. But the ratio has a big impact, as we'll see next. The profitability metrics for efficiency innovations always are better than those of sustaining innovations by the math. And the profitability metrics for sustaining innovations always are higher than the metrics for disruptive innovations. And disruptive innovations always struggle to attract capital and managerial attention. And it's in the math. And the result of that is that the metrics that we use on the prior slide take the capital of a company and funnel that in the resource allocation process to spend more and more of our money in efficiency innovations. And that's the problem. So we have a lot of free cash flow, so we have to have analysts to figure out where should we put our money. So I look at this and I say, you know, maybe we ought to invest our money for a new round of growth in disruptive innovations. Darn it, these things pay off in 5 to 10 years. And so IRR is going to go down. These guys need capital, and so RONA is going to go down. On the other hand, if we use our capital to invest in another round of efficiency innovations, RONA goes up, IRR goes up, there's no risk, the market's there. So if you wouldn't mind, just this once, I think I might use my capital to create more capital. And then I have a big problem because I got to invest that money too. And I look at disruptive innovations and darn it, just by the metrics, it doesn't pay off. So maybe just one more time, I'm going to invest in. And over again, we invest our capital to create more capital and to create more capital. And so there is capital everywhere. The cost of capital is nearly zero, and we continue to behave as if capital is scarce. And if you want to know where America is headed, just look at Japan. Because during the 1960s and 70s, if you remember, Japan was growing at unprecedented rates. And what was the engine of that? Toyota made products so affordable and accessible that college students could have a car. Honda did the very same thing in motorcycles. Sony did the very same thing to consumer electronics. The reason why you guys have a printer in your office or your home is Canon built Xerox. But since 1990 in Japan, they use the same metrics of investment. And since 1990, they have developed only one disruptive innovation, which is the Nintendo Wii. But I think it's the only one. And all of their money goes into some sustaining, but primarily efficiency innovations. And boy, they are good at that. But what has been the result? For the last 25 years, Japan's economy has just been a flat line. There is capital everywhere. The cost of capital is zero, and they can't invest to grow because of the metrics put them in that situation. And unfortunately, thanks to you guys, in America, we still do a little bit of this. But if it weren't for you guys, we would be heading down that route even faster than we already are. You know the story about milkshakes. The theme I'd like you to remember is that what causes us to buy a product is we have a job to do. And if you understand what the job is, the probability that you'll succeed is very high. Now, understanding what the job is has a big impact on your success. So think about the New York Times. Originally, there was a job to do, which is I want to know the news. And the New York Times on the East Coast did that very, very well. But then they saw that their customers also had other jobs that arise in their lives that they need to get done too. And so maybe we ought to get the New York Times and keep adding sections so that you could hire the New York Times to do all kinds of things. And so very quickly, the New York Times had a section in it to do all of these things. I could have personal advertisements if I need to buy or sell stuff. If I need a job, I can do that. If I need to hire somebody to do a job, I could do that too. help me be informed. That's what the New York Times used to be all about. And as they have done that, there have been focused competitors around a single job to be done. And by focusing on a single job, the New York Times, which tries to do everything for everybody, just loses its salience to most people, and they're going down the cliff. We see that now happening at banks. They had a focused job to be done at the beginning, but as they could see that those customers have other jobs to do, maybe we ought to make more and more so that our customers can do more and more business with us. And the result of that is they became very unfocused, didn't do any of these jobs very well, and thanks to you guys, there are focused FinBank companies just blossoming around us, each one of them focused on a single jobs to be done. And one of the reasons why this is so important for us is that we're investing to create growth. We need to remember that keeping that focus is very important to success. Now, this is the last one, which is the law of conservation of modularity. And I'll just do this in the context of banking, but it applies to everything you invest in. There are interfaces. Historically, in a traditional bank, they have the back end that has to happen every day without fail. And then there are services that they're trying to offer to their customers. And historically, the interaction, the interface between those has been interdependent, meaning if I change one thing, I have to change everything. And it was very hard to get out of that relationship because of the interdependence. But on the other hand, where the interface was between banking services and the customer, that was a modular interface. FICO is a way to do it. And everybody knew that if you want to disengage with the bank, you could go to another bank and insert yourself. And because of this modularization of that interface, it was easy for customers to go. And so the banks complained that there's no stickiness with their customers. But it's because this interface is standard that everybody had to adopt. But I think what's happening from the prior slide is that there is opening a modular standard interface between a particular bank that we might call a web bank that does the back-end stuff. And then there are a whole bunch of focused companies around jobs to be done to do those things. And the way these guys interface with their customers is very proprietary and interdependent. So the interface, I write books. Every customer gives me 5 stores or 3 stores or whatever. But we have an interdependent interface. And the law of conservation of modularity means that where you make money is where there's an interdependent interface. And so where you made money, you don't make money. And where you didn't make money, you make money. And this interaction, I think, is really quite an exciting thing for some of the things that you guys are investing in here. So that's what I've been thinking about. And I hope that some of these things might be useful for you. Well, thanks so much.